Okay, guys. So taking a look here at the causes of the Civil War. So as we kind of get started here looking at the causes, we're also going to recap a little bit from Western expansion and talking about the Union in peril, how the extension of slavery became a real issue when it came to Western expansion. That is also a leading cause to the Civil War. But we're also going to add in some more of the social and political aspects that are going to lead to the Civil War as well. So economically, starting to look at the differences between the North and the South. In the early 1800s, we started to see sectionalism rise. We know that the North is going to become an industrial giant. They're going to be focusing on textile mills and other forms of production. One of the things that the North does is invest in transportation. So they wanted national roads, they were building canals, but then with the introduction of the steam engine, they start to build railroad tracks. And so the vast majority of the country's railroad tracks were located in the north. And so we start to see cities like Pittsburgh and New York and Boston really become those areas of population growth kind of pop up overnight. We have mass forms of communication where those railroad lines are also going to be the telegraph lines. Many of the arriving immigrants, so we saw in the reform movement the increased number of Irish and German immigrants. Most of them are going to settle in the North because that is where the most job opportunities are. The immigrants were opposed to slavery, not necessarily from a moral standpoint, but from an economic standpoint. They saw slavery and the institution of slavery as competition. It did not give them equal opportunity for work, particularly in the South. They also believed that African Americans should have the right to vote within the United States. This is going to be vastly different from the Southern point of view. The Southern society was still a very rural society. So even though a third of the population, of the United States population, resided in the South, only 10% of the industry was located there. Their land was far more valuable to them in regards to the form of agriculture. So they did not invest in canals or roads or railroads as much as the North. They still relied on their river systems as their main mode of transportation to free up the land to grow cotton and other cash crops. There are not going to be as many immigrants that arrive in the South because of the lack of job opportunities. The role of slavery there was their main workforce, and so there's very little opportunity with really no manufacturing centers for them to be able to find work. So those sectional differences we're going to see continue to grow and grow, not only in economic terms, but also social and political terms. Now, to recap a little bit of what was leading up to this historic novel here, Uncle Tom's Cabin, you have to remember that in the early 1800s, we start to see the beginnings of the abolitionist movement. And at the heart of the abolitionist movement is to start to recognize that the institution of slavery was a moral issue. It was morally wrong. And a lot of this was being fed by the Second Great Awakening. Many citizens were turning back to religion, turning back to church, and many felt that the institution of slavery went against traditional Christian principles. And so abolition are going to be ones who are going to be pushing to abolish or get rid of the institution of slavery altogether. And so we saw this, the abolitionist movement growing with the Underground Railroad. We see it growing with the Compromise of 1850, with the increased fugitive slave law, a lot of outbursts and pushback against the fugitive slave law. And so the Underground Railroad is kind of a response to that. Something else that is going to be a response to the Fugitive Slave Act and the institution of slavery in the South is going to be a fictional novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. So it was published in 1852 and is written by a woman, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was an active abolitionist. And so she is starting to paint the image that slavery was not just a political or economic issue, but really a moral struggle. So trying to bring in one's moral compass when it came to the terms of slavery. When the book was published, it was highly controversial. It was going to be published in the North and in the South, and there's going to be varying opinions. The Northerners, this is just going to increase their support for the abolitionist movement. Harriet Beecher Stowe painted a very vivid image of some loving characters about the experiences of slavery, and the brutality of it. And so trying to go against what we saw of the reform era, of how many people tried to paint the image that slavery was a good thing, that this, that slaves were part of the family and that they were taken care of. She is painting a very different image of the brutality, the whippings, the even killing of slaves and one's property. Southerners felt it was an attack on their way of life and felt it was an exaggerated portrayal of the institution of slavery. So many Southerners were extremely angry and kind of taken aback at how Harriet Beecher Stowe had created this storyline. And she had the book based down in Louisiana along the Red River, where there was a very large slave population. So many Southerners start to ban the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin within the region, but it does continue to spread throughout the North. Lincoln read Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, and as he was running for senator and then as president, he actually met Harriet Beecher Stowe, and one of his quotes was, "So this is the little lady who made the big war," because this is where people really do start to take sides on the issue of slavery. So after Harriet Beecher Stowe's publication comes up the issue of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. So we took a look at that in regards to expansion and how we were going to institute the policy of popular sovereignty, where individuals within those territories would vote to determine whether or not they would be a free territory or a slave territory. Well, the violence that is going to take place to get the nickname Bleeding Kansas isn't just going to be in that territory. We're going to start to see armed violence, and fighting start to take place within our own political arena, up on Capitol Hill. And this all stems from the concern with popular sovereignty and the situation that was taking place in Kansas. So on May 19th in 1856, there was a Senator, Charles Sumner, who delivered a speech where he was calling out his fellow senators, how they were just kind of sitting by and not really addressing the issue of slavery or addressing the issue of what was happening in Kansas. He did not believe popular sovereignty would ever work. And so as he attacked his colleagues for their support of slavery or the institution of slavery, he particularly targeted a senator from South Carolina, Andrew Butler. He targeted Andrew Butler not only because he was from a southern state, but Andrew Butler also had a speech impediment. And so he began to mock Andrew Butler as he tried to defend the institution against Charles Sumner's accusations against the institution of slavery. Well, 3 days later, Butler's nephew, also a fellow congressman, Preston Brooks, took great offense to how Senator Charles Sumner spoke to his uncle, and also how he addressed many of the senators in the institution of slavery. So he actually came onto the Senate floor. He wasn't a senator himself. He was a congressman, so he was from the House of Representatives. But he came on the Senate floor, and he walked over to Charles Sumner and said, I read your speech twice through, and it was offensive to him and his uncle. He took great personal offense that this was an attack not only on the institution of slavery, but an attack on his family. And he took his cane, his walking cane, and he hit Sumner over the head 5 or 6 times, severe blows, to the point that Sumner essentially suffered from a mass concussion, and he wasn't able to return to the Senate for 3 years as he tried to recover from his injuries. And so this just kind of goes to show that even in a civil situation that should be within our legislative branch of our government, that the issue was starting to get to the point of physical violence and physical harm to one another. Many Southerners wrote letters of applause. They even sent numbers of new canes to Preston Brooks. One fellow Southern representative even had one inscribed with "Hit him again." So, this is just starting to show that increasing sectional divide between the Southerners and the Northerners. Of course, the Northerners condemned the incident, and they said this is only just an example of Southern brutality and antagonism toward free speech. Charles Sumner had a right to express his views against slavery, and that Southerners could not take everything as a personable offense. And the idea of Southern brutality, that was just kind of, again, reinforcing some of the exaggerations that Harriet Beecher Stowe had emphasized in Uncle Tom's Cabin, that if they could be so brutal to their own fellow man, that just kind of sums up that they could be even more harsh and more brutal towards their slaves that they saw as property. And so this is just going to increase that further divide within the region. And so this is a famous publication that was printed in newspapers, both in the North and the South. So talking about, again, that the Southern chivalry, argument versus club. So using the cane to beat Charles Sumner. Politics are definitely going to have the issue of slavery as part of their debate and part of their organizing when it came to selecting candidates leading up to the Civil War. So the election of 1856, this is the election one of the elections before the start of the Civil War, and really the election before Abraham Lincoln will be elected president. So at this time, we start to see emerging some new political parties. The Republican Party was primarily in the North. They were made up of Free Soilers. Free Soilers are individuals who did not want to see slavery extend into new territory. But there is a distinct difference between a Free Soiler and an abolitionist. An abolitionist wanted to completely abolish slavery, get rid of the institution. They found it morally wrong. Free Soilers didn't necessarily find the institution of slavery morally wrong. They just did not want to see the institution spread into new territory. They were supportive of racial laws that essentially limited the rights of African Americans. So if you remember from the Reform movement, we looked at resources that demonstrated the Northern oppression. Not all Northerners were against the institution of slavery and saw African Americans as their equals. Some still saw them as inferior citizens, but they felt that the institution of slavery was outdated and needed to go away. And so many Free Soilers started to side with the Republicans because of their anti-slavery agenda. Another party that emerged were the Know-Nothings. And this is where we start to see a split. The Know-Nothing Party were nativists, so those who were concerned with the growing number of immigrants coming into the country. They wanted to focus on native-born American citizens and felt that they should be the ones to have the power in the decision-making. So the Know-Nothings did get some support in regards to, they did get some Free Soilers that were part of the nativist movement and wanting to abolish slavery. So there's going to be a split. People of the North either sided with the Republicans or they went with the Know-Nothing Party. So the Northerners, who were kind of Know-Nothings, who also had similar ideas as Republicans, supported their candidate in John C. Fremont. Southerners of the Know-Nothing Party actually went for former President Millard Fillmore. So what we see are the Democrats, okay? So kind of the remnants of the Jacksonian Democrats who are going to support James Buchanan. Now, James Buchanan is what we call a national candidate because James Buchanan was from Pennsylvania, even though majority of Democrats are situated in the South. So that was the thing. It was trying to select a candidate that would keep the country together and not promote a sectional divide. And so that's what's eventually going to allow James Buchanan to be elected president. He was a Northerner, but he had friends in Washington, even though Washington is kind of southern, within the southern region, are centrally located just above the southern region there. He, again, that national candidate is going to help him reach both sides. And his running mate, John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, was, from Kentucky, was a Southerner. So that's also going to help get the Southern support for James Buchanan. So looking at the election results here, you can see that Buchanan is going to have an overwhelming number of the states. However, he only has 45% of the popular vote. So he got pretty much all of the South with the exception of Maryland. Fremont, who was the candidate of the Republican Party of the North, he got 33% of the popular vote, and he got 11 of the 16 free states. And so the remaining, with Fillmore coming from the Know Nothing Party, got 22% of the popular vote. So the main takeaway from this election is the fact that Democrats could win the presidency with a national candidate. So the significance of having a candidate from the North partnered with a vice president from the South could still keep that unity within the country. So they could compete in both regions. The Know Nothings were, and the remaining Whig Party were starting to decline, okay, with that split over the issue of slavery and which candidates they were going to support. And what this also showed is that the Republicans are going to be the political force of the North. So we really start to see a divide really amongst the Republicans versus the Democrats. Now remember, this Republican Party and this Democratic Party have no affiliation with our current Republican and Democratic Party. So after the election of 1856, we see another major issue come up in regards to politics. And in this time, this case is going to be brought up in regards to our Supreme Court, Dred Scott versus Sanford. So Dred Scott, pictured there on the right, was a slave. A slave whose owner had taken him from a slave state of Missouri and taken him into the free territory of Illinois. So Dred Scott, and it wasn't like it was just a visit. They lived in Illinois for a couple of years. So Dred Scott, feeling that he lived in free territory for, I think it was like 5 or 6 years, felt that this was an adequate amount of time to demand that if he was in free territory, then he should himself be free. So he's going to sue for his freedom, stating that by living in that free territory, that made him a free man. This brought up two questions when it reached the Supreme Court. One, was Scott considered a legal citizen? If he was a slave, he is seen as property and doesn't have any citizenship rights, which means he couldn't sue in a federal court. This whole case essentially would be thrown out. The second question, did residence in a free territory, no matter how long you were there, make Scott a free man, even though he returned to a slave state? So they went back to the state of Missouri. So this is a decision that has to be determined by the Supreme Court. And it's going to be an important decision that's going to have ramifications in other areas as well. So at the time, the Chief Justice was Roger Taney. And the results of this case was that, one, the first question, Scott was not a citizen. He lacked any legal standing to be able to sue in the federal court because he was not a citizen. He could not vote, which means he was not guaranteed a trial by a jury or any representation in the Supreme Court. The second issue on hand was that the property rights. Okay, so the Fifth Amendment guarantees one's right to private property in the United States. So this ruled on the second question. So even though Dred Scott was taken into free territory, he was technically by law in the home state of Missouri seen as property to his owner. So even though they're going into a free territory, his property owner could not be denied his right to property. Okay, so, and again, this is where the Constitution trumps state law. So the state law of Illinois says it is a free state. However, the Constitution with the Fifth Amendment says you are guaranteed your right to property and you can take your property anywhere in the country. It cannot be denied to you. So what this ruling means throughout the rest of the country is that territories that had once excluded slavery, so essentially all the free states, could not deprive slave owners of their property in that territory. Which also means the big debate in the Western territories like Kansas and Nebraska was kind of a null void conversation, that really those territories could not deny individuals' rights to hold slaves in those territories, no matter what the people voted for, because individuals have their right to property. And so essentially this also made the Missouri Compromise okay, where one state free, one state slave, and anything above the line of 3630 was free. Anything below that line was slave territory, made it unconstitutional because you cannot designate territory where individuals cannot have the right to property. So ultimately, the Dred Scott case was seen as a huge victory by Southern states, and saw this as a means to be able to extend the institution of slavery. So then this brings in some Senate debates for the state of Illinois, where Dred Scott had been taken. So in the 1858 race for the Illinois Senate positions, we're going to see two candidates emerge. We've got Douglas, okay, Stephen Douglas, who is a Democrat, who he's kind of the mastermind behind the Kansas-Nebraska Act and components of the Compromise of 1850 with the concept of popular sovereignty. So he felt, popular sovereignty was the essence of democracy. Allow the individuals in that territory to determine whether or not they were going to have slaves. So on a personal note, Stephen Douglas also didn't think slavery was immoral, just it was unsuited for the Great Plains or the Prairie region. And so the institution didn't need to be in that area. On the other side of this was the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln did believe that slavery was immoral and wrong. He felt it was a great evil of American society. And he didn't believe that slavery should spread into the new territory, whether people voted for it or not. And so they're going to have a lot of open air debates, meaning, a lot of public speeches about the issue of slavery in regards to territories. And so this is where both the Democrats and the Republicans are kind of shaping and molding their impressions of these two individuals. These debates are going to be extremely important when Lincoln runs for president, because his personal views of slavery start to be misconstrued with his political agenda when it comes to slavery. And so that is going to be something that Lincoln has to clearly define when he's running for president. Unfortunately, it's going to fall on deaf ears in the South. One of the famous speeches by Stephen Douglas was the Freeport Doctrine. And so this is where Stephen Douglas is going to argue that the territories did not need to enforce slavery. So he's kind of undermining the Dred Scott decision. So this is where he's saying the territories or states can actually vote to be free. They would merely have to put into place law enforcement, so essentially a special police force or law enforcement force that would not uphold slave property laws. So essentially would not uphold the Dred Scott versus Sanford ruling. And so this is just a painting and images demonstrating those debates. So those open air debates where people would come all around to listen to these senators. Because again, they don't have the means of media like radio or TV or internet yet to be able to demonstrate their views to the public. So they would have to hold multiple debates throughout the state of Illinois to reach their constituents. Another incident that continues to build further divide and leading to the Civil War was an incident that took place in Harpers Ferry. Now, Harpers Ferry is in present-day West Virginia, but at this time it was part of the state of Virginia. And it was a raid led by John Brown. So we talked about John Brown and the controversial tactics that he used in Kansas. So he was the one who led raids against pro-slavery families within Kansas and went into their homes and murdered many pro-slavery individuals because he felt this calling by God to abolish the institution of slavery. So now John Brown is taking his abolitionist work to Virginia. And so in Harpers Ferry, there is an arsenal with weapons. His intent with a couple of followers was to seize the arsenal and distribute the weapons in that arsenal to local slaves to hopefully start a slave rebellion. Brown and his followers are going to be barricaded in. Okay, they are attempts to try to get a hold of the arsenal are going to be found out. And so local militia will arrive. 10 men were killed. The local Virginia militia was actually led by Robert E. Lee, who's going to lead that raid and capture John Brown. So John Brown is turned over to the authorities. He's going to be put on trial, and he's going to be convicted and tried for treason. So December 2nd of 1859 is when John Brown is going to be put on trial. At this time, is kind of a year after, again, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas are still expressing their opinions in regards to the institution of slavery. Both found the actions of John Brown to be a murderer. So even though he was an abolitionist and he was trying to lead a slave rebellion, they didn't think arming slaves was the right way to bring about the abolishment of slavery. So in the North, many people criticized John Brown. They saw him as a madman. However, they admired his motives, the extent that he was going to try to abolish the institution of slavery. And so some Northerners are even going to start to call John Brown a martyr, and was dying for the cause of freedom. But this is just going to fuel for some Northerners their anti-slavery, anti-Southern fire. And so just again, continuing to pull the country apart. In the South, this is going to create a bit of hysteria, that if abolitionists are willing to come down and try to arm slaves and lead a rebellion, this instills fear, especially in the state of Virginia, where the Nat Turner Rebellion had taken place down in the Southampton region, and where, Nat Turner's had led a slave revolt where they had killed local white citizens. That fear was still there. And to think that abolitionists would come and try to start another rebellion is only going to increase those tensions. And for some Southerners, this is where they start to talk about the thoughts of secession and leaving the Union completely. Now bring in the election of 1860. So this is where the Republicans decide to go with Abraham Lincoln. He's relatively unknown throughout the country. As we've talked about the Stephen Douglas and Lincoln debates, again, that was centrally located to the state of Illinois. Lincoln's position, he wanted to halt the further spread of slavery. So as I mentioned earlier, Lincoln during his Senate debates said slavery was an immoral evil that had to be gotten rid of. But that was his own personal views. In regards to politics, Lincoln only wanted to halt the spread of slavery. And so he wanted to assure the South, and he told the South, he would not interfere with those who currently own slaves. He just did not want to see the institution spread into the new territories. So this is where he needed the South to have open ears, and they, in often cases, didn't. Many Southerners feared Lincoln took by his own personal views was out to abolish slavery completely. They were not listening to his political message where he says, I don't want to interfere where slavery is right now. I'm not looking to abolish slaves in the South. I'm not looking to abolish the institution within the South. I'm just looking to stop it from spreading to other territories. Northern Democrats are going to support Stephen Douglas. So again, those Lincoln-Douglas debates. Southern Democrats are going to support the former vice president from the previous election with James Buchanan with Breckinridge. Okay. Another party that's starting to emerge is the Constitutional Union Party with the support of John Bell. Well, the winner in this case had less than half of the popular vote. There was absolutely no Southern electoral votes for the support of this candidate. And this candidate who won was really supported by sectional support, not a national candidate like the former James Buchanan. And ultimately, the candidate who won was Abraham Lincoln. And so after he is elected, almost immediately, Southern states start to call for secession because they feel that the abolishment of slavery is inevitable to happen under Lincoln's administration. So looking at the results here, even though Lincoln did not win the popular vote, he wins enough support in those northern states to be able to win the election. So, Southern secession. South Carolina will be the first state to secede. So, on December 20th, 1860, is when they announced that they are seceding and leaving the Union. They formed the Confederate States of America. By February, 6 other states had also began to secede. So, Confederacy, a grouping of states to come together, like the Articles of Confederation, our first form of government. The Confederate States of America are going to form a very similar government to the Articles of Confederation. And as we'll see throughout the Civil War, a lot of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation are going to be major political weaknesses for the Confederate States of America. But the Confederate States is formed on February 4th, 1861, and slavery is going to be one of the main issues that is addressed under the Confederate States of America, and the institution of slavery will be protected and recognized. Each state is sovereign and independent, again, like the Articles of Confederation. They will have equal representation and equal voice within the Confederate States of American government, which again is going to be a bit problematic, as we will see later on in the war. Their first and only president will be Jefferson Davis from Mississippi. So we see a bit of calm before the storm being the Civil War. So Lincoln, of course, did not immediately take office. So he's elected in November of 1860. By December, we have South Carolina seceding. And by February of 1861, we have the Confederate States of America formed, with the number of southern states that were starting to secede. Buchanan, who is still currently president, declared the Confederate States of America to be illegal. But there really wasn't much that he could do. He couldn't force those states to stay within the Union. Washington was a southern city. And so this is where many individuals within DC of Southern descent, especially representatives from those states that has seceded, start to make their resignations known and start to leave DC. And so this kind of creates a situation for Lincoln when he is sworn in. Would those states be allowed to leave without a fight? And as a quote from Lincoln, he says, "A house divided cannot stand." And so he is not going to see a divided country. It says, divided United States will not be able to stand. And so if it comes to a fight, he's willing to preserve the Union. That is the ultimate goal of Abraham Lincoln, not to abolish slavery, but to preserve the Union and keep the United States together. And so that is going to be his motivation to begin the Civil War.